Hi, in this lecture we will be discussing mixing. But before we do that, let's do a quick review on what we have learned so far in APT in the first 2 weeks. We've discussed trimming, fading, elastic time, elastic pitch, elastic properties, comping vocals, blending vocals, internal buzzing and re-recording, copy and pasting the individual sections over to the right spots, then import session data, creating new session, how to accurately copy snares over and paste them in the right spots, cleaning tom tracks, how to quantize with elastic audio drums. We discussed phase alignment, how to import audio clips with spot mode, one of my favorites, side chaining and key gating. And we also discussed some automation basics, how to create your submixer and effect channels, and how to actually already blend. So our first step in mixing is really already in progress. So today's topic will be macro mixing. Now this might be a new term to you, but macro mixing basically is the first 80% of your mix. It is where a lot of your dynamic processing and time-based processing has started, but it will still be fine-tuned in what we later call micro mixing. The steps of macro mixing are fairly easy. You already started some of them, but what really needs to be focused on is what is mixing all about. Mixing is about delivering the emotional content of the music. That means if it's a sad song, this has to reflect in how we mix the song. If it's a happy song, it has to reflect in how we mix it. What kind of EQs we apply, how wet it is, how much reverb we're using, how much compression there is. So in more aggressive songs, you can use more compression, and in lighter songs, you obviously can't use as much. But when you usually receive a session that you're just mixing, and I'm really assuming at this point that this is not a session you're producing. I want to approach this from a mix engineer standpoint. And as producers, we often wear multiple hats. But it has happened many times in my career that I just mixed something. I had nothing to do with its production. And at that point, you have to have a little bit of a different approach because you're not familiar with the actual project and the material in the session. So the first thing you should do is really audition the session. That means play it through all the way through, get a feel for what they sent you, the rough mix of it. This is kind of a representation of how they envisioned the song to sound like a little bit. I often do this in multiple layers and listen through it a few times while I'll solo individual tracks, kind of get a feel for how everything sounds. Try to kind of find where the issues are already and kind of make mental notes of it. Then when I have a pretty good picture of what material I'm dealing with, then the next step would be to completely neutralize the mix, and that means you turn everything all the way down. You would at that point check your track layout, make sure that it has the correct layout, which we've discussed before. It should always be drums, bass, guitars, keyboards, lead vocal, background vocal, sound effects, submixer, and effect channel. And remember, live is always before sequenced in the same group. That means live drums would be before sequenced drums or percussions. And then you check for phase, which is also another step we have already completed. We already checked the phase of the drums, and they're already edited, and the session is ready to be mixed. While you're listening to this, you can already identify, even just with a 2-track rough mix, what the most important instrument in your mix really is. Obviously, if there's vocals in it, then your lead vocal would be the most important track. But what is the next instrument from drums to guitars to keyboards that really represents the emotion of the song? So you have to kind of identify that. Now there are 3 criteria that we can look at to label every single instrument in your track, and there's really only three. There's rhythmic, harmonic, and melodic. Now anything that's a drum and a percussion obviously falls under the rhythmic element. Anything that's a vocal usually falls under the melodic if it's a lead vocal. Now we have a lot of instruments that actually fall into multiples of these and combinations of these. So let's look at, for instance, at the acoustic guitar or nylon guitar 1 that plays the chords, harmonic, in a rhythmic. So it basically falls onto two categories. Let's look at the background vocals. They are harmonic because they have harmonies, and melodic because some areas are in what we call unison. But they are also rhythmic because the melody itself has a rhythmic element to it. So they literally fall under three different categories. The piano falls under the harmonic, it doesn't have a lot of rhythm. The bass falls under melodic rhythmic. It's a single note and it is rhythmic. And then we have strings, harmonic. So you see how everything falls under a specific category. Now you can also identify at this point as well, if something is harmonic and rhythmic, it usually has a very important part in your song, because it not only gives you the chord progression of the song that is important for the lead vocal to make sense, it also gives you a rhythmical element, which we all know in a mix. The rhythmical elements is what drives your mix. So we can already identify that the nylon guitar is a very important element to drive the song and give you the harmonic and emotional content that the song needs. Well, when you're mixing, you're really concentrating on four different things. So the first thing would be levels. Now when we are starting, we create a nice blend, and we did this in the last exercise for 4 times, starting each time with a different element: vocals, drums, maybe bass, guitar, whatever you decided. That will create a good blend and a balanced track, which in my opinion is essential before you move on to the next step. I can't emphasize enough how much you will struggle if your blend is not right in the first place before you start using dynamic processing, because fixing a blend cannot really be done with dynamic processing. It has to be right first, and it really gets you a very long way. Consider dynamic processing just fine-tuning of a great blend. Well, after you have done that, that is exactly where we will go. And once you have achieved that great blend, we will go to dynamic processing, which means we will EQ and compress most, if not all, of the tracks. Now there's something to be said about not everything needs to have an EQ because it already sounds good. But I can also counter that argument by saying nothing gets ever heard by adding one band of EQ to anything to enhance it, or sometimes, most of the times, even to just high pass filter and to make sure there's nothing going on in the very, very low frequencies under 75 Hertz that will later on present problems and create confusion in the low end. Now, imaging can already, and most likely will be part of your leveling, because you're already panning things. But imaging can now go even a step further, and in your mix you will still continuously fine-tune your imaging because things will change. Once you start processing, you will start to see how you have to fill this space, this 180 degrees, how we experience music, and you will change the placement of some of the things. You might even use some plugins that spread the sound. There are several now, especially in 10 and 11 of Pro Tools there, and in Logic there's a spreader. But you have to be very careful, because using these spreaders creates phasing issues and can really cause your mix to lose distinction. Next thing we have to consider is mono versus stereo. Just because a track is on a stereo track does not mean it's actually stereo. And I'm going to show you a tool, a free tool, that lets you analyze how stereo a sound really is. And then the fourth step would be to add your reverbs, your delays, your choruses, your modulations, anything time-based processed. And those are the 4 elements of mixing. When we mix, we should set ourselves some milestones. Now, with our previous project, we have already started by zeroing the levels, and we created an adequate mix. That means it's a nice blend. But what we're trying to do is get from adequate to distinctive. That means all the sounds have a place in the mix. Everything can be heard and understood. Everything is separated from each other, but yet it's coherent with each other. Now, this is done through dynamic processing, EQ and compression. A lot of things are too dynamic, so you add a little bit of compression, which tucks it into the mix a little more, but it also lets you often turn things up a little more than you usually could. EQ is definitely going to create that separation between instruments occupying the same frequency space. So EQ is probably one of the most important things. And then once we created that distinction, again, we go in through the 4 levels. We start adding time-based plugins. Now, my recommendation in the macro mix is go light. It doesn't need a lot. A little bit of space creates a lot of depth. Too much effects will often destroy all the distinction and separation that you have created with your EQ and compression. So you have to be careful with it, but you have to find good levels. Once we get to that, we have reached the end of the macro mix, which is the mix sounds stable. At that point, and even in between and before and during the entire process, you should reference as often as possible. Referencing is one of the most important things to achieve a commercially acceptable mix. Keyword being commercially acceptable. Millions of songs have been mixed, and there's a certain standard in what people are used to hearing. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're only trying to get to that level of accuracy, separation, distinction, and sonic quality that these mixes that are playing on radio nowadays are. That means we should listen to mixes in our genre that are relating to the material that we are mixing as often as possible. Our ears have the incredible skill of making things sound better than they really are if you listen to it long enough. So breaking up that cycle of just listening to your own mix over and over has so many benefits throughout your mixing process. Even if you just listen to another song for a minute, it will already give you a whole new perspective of where your mix needs to go. Besides that, listening to other speakers can also make sure that your mix translates well to all different types of listening environments. Just because it sounds great on your speakers doesn't mean it will sound great in somebody's car, on their headphones, on their earbuds, on radio. It's all different. So it's very important for us to listen to as many places as we can. So let's compare what's going to happen after the macro mixing to the micro mixing, which will be the step next week. And it's kind of important to understand that where we should stop before we go to micro mixing. Right? So if you consider macro mixing kind of the rough mixing, which it really isn't, but it's compared to what we will do in micro mixing, it is kind of rough because all the EQs and dynamic processing every single one will be fine-tuned when we get to micro mixing. So we create a distinction with EQ and compression, and the separation in the highs and lows is one of the hardest things to do. And we listen to things like, can I understand every word that the singer is saying or singing? Is the vocal at a good level? A really loud vocal can also destroy a mix. So a good balance here is very important. But the most important question is, did you enhance the emotional content? Now remember, sad songs should sound sad. Happy songs should sound happy. Which if you think of EQ and what it does to a sound, if we relate bright to happy and dark to unhappy, or sad, then that already gives us an idea of how certain things should be EQ'd. As example, if you're in a dance record and it's a very happy dance record and you add a very dark sounding piano, it might kind of clash with the emotion of the song. So most likely you will EQ that piano in that record very bright and cutting through. Let's take that same example and say you're working on an Evanescence record, heavy rock, a lot of guitars, and you're adding this really bright piano on top of this dark record. It will probably stick out. It won't match the emotional content of the song, and most likely will mix a little more in the mids and lows. So while we're doing all these things and while we're achieving this distinctiveness, we are referencing. It is so important. One of my main tricks is to listen really quietly. I have two sets of speakers. One is a very expensive set of Meyer HD1s, and my other one is the typical studio speaker set, the Yamaha NS10s. Now, I know that the Yamaha NS10s are not the greatest speakers, but if I can get my mix to sound great on those speakers, it will sound great everywhere. So I often switch to the not so great speakers to hear what it would sound like in somebody's home stereo. And then I also listen to it very low, because a lot of people listen to music while they're cleaning the kitchen or while they're doing some work, and they're not blasting it. So we have to make sure that our mix, again, that word translate you will hear a lot. It has to translate to loud and low, to good speakers, bad speakers, headphones. And often what I love to do is actually get my level up high, step outside the room, go into a whole entire other room, and hear how it would sound from another location. A lot of things will be discovered when you do that. I've had situations happen where I thought the hi-hat was absolutely perfect where I was sitting, and I step outside and I hear the hi-hat is really, really loud, because it translates completely different. So it's a great trick. But my favorite, without a question, is listening in the car. And that is simply because that's where I listen to most of my music. On the way to work, from work, on the way to shop. You spend so much time listening to music in your car that is probably the one environment you are most familiar with. And that also means that your ear is tuned into what things should sound like. And if you play your mix, you can hopefully immediately identify when your bass is too loud, or your kick is too low, or the snare needs more attack, or it's not bright enough, the vocal is too low, whatever the issue is. Then we take it to the next step. Now all these things will be repeated, but in a much finer way. Now when I say coarse and fine, I mean in macro mixing you might add 3 dB or 4K at a certain EQ, and or attenuate 4 dB at 200 Hertz at a kick, or whatever that is. It's a fairly coarse range, 3 to 4 dB. In micro mixing, all those EQs will be fine-tuned, maybe another band added, but in a much finer state. Half a dB, 1 dB, 1.5 dB is usually all you will do in micro mixing. So we are fine-tuning that distinctiveness even more and creating that real separation that lets you hear everything, but yet you hear it all together. But you can identify each individual instrument. One of the hardest parts, again, is the clarity in the bottom and the highs. Kick and bass can be really tricky, especially if you have a sub kick with it. They all need to find a very particular place so they don't, I say mess with each other, but that's really not a very scientific term, right? But so they don't interfere with each other's sonic quality and cover each other up. On the other hand, the highs can be just as problematic because you have a lot of different instruments trying to occupy that place. So finding a specific nudge for each one of those instruments in the highs, the strings, the guitars, the piano, the vocal, the hi-hats, the shaker, the congas, the pad, can be tricky. Now you do apply some automation in macro mixing, especially to really enhance the emotion. Often you need to bring certain things up and down, but most of that is done in a very coarse way. The real fine-tuning of the automation, and this is where I usually spend a third on my mix time on automation, is in the micro-mixing stage, fine-tuning in each individual level to be constant, but sometimes even to bring certain things out of the mix. And this is very important. This is where the magic happens. Especially when you're dealing with live instrumentation, you will see that some players will, play what's on the part, and they play little things in between that really give the song life. It might just be one little lick that is a transitional piece between a verse and a chorus. But those kind of things at continuous level will not really be heard. But when you raise those things by 2 dB or so, you can really enhance the mix overall, because you're creating things that are non-continuous, which is actually the part that pulls the listener back into your mix. Now, this has to be done in a reasonable way. You can't just suddenly have something jump out of the mix and completely distract the listener from the overall emotion. But to bring certain things up can really enhance the flow. And it's almost like you're adding a reversed reverb, reversed cymbal going into a chorus. It almost has that effect if you have a cool guitar lick going from one part to the other and you just raise that a little. Now, fine-tuning the time-based plugins, the reverbs, is probably one of the most important parts in micro-mixing. Because we might push these reverbs up a little more, but now we're going to have to find that feeling of depth, where it doesn't sound like we're in a huge hall. It still sounds natural, but it gives us that perception of how the sound travels this way. And often the spectrum of a reverb is the same as the spectrum of the entire track. So a reverb of a vocal might go from 100 Hertz to 10K. Well, this would clog up all the clarity, distinction, and separation that we have created prior. So we now have to use our heads a little bit, think about that for a second, and say, okay, if I'm going to make this vocal really, really bright, so it can really stick out on top of the mix, should I also make the reverb very bright? Most of the times you will have to go in and fine adjust the length, the pre-delay, and then actually add an EQ after that reverb to fine-tune how it sits in the mix. If I, for instance, one of my tricks I'd love to do is have the lead vocal a little brighter than the background vocals, but then have the reverb on the lead vocal a little darker than the reverb on the background vocals. So kind of offset how they sound. And darker reverbs will sound a little closer to you. So while you're mixing the background vocals a little further back, you can actually add more of a darker reverb. All kind of small little tricks that have to be done in a very fine way. During this entire process, we obviously watched our levels. And while in the macro mixing stage, we want to stay at an RMS, an average, between -10 and -12, you will see that over time, by adding all this dynamic processing and additional levels by reverbs and delays and other things, that you will come up to that desired range of -3, -4 RMS all by itself. It has been my experience in every mix that I've done that even starting that low, I'll end up right at -3, -4. So that's a good starting point. But the final level, before we apply a little bit of compression and EQ to the master mix, should be right around that -3 to -4 peak. And again, referencing. It's so important. So let's talk about EQing. And some of these things that I want to talk about here are things that you most likely will already know, or at least you should. Haven't been in this program for at least 29 months and haven't EQ'd probably many sessions. But I want to revisit some of the things, what EQing really does and what type of EQs we have. So what does EQ do? Well, one thing it does, it balances the sound. So if you have a piano that might sound way darker than a real piano, then you attenuate some of the low mids to make it sound more natural. And that would be balancing the sound out. Our goal is to make it sound natural. But we can also shape things. To me, balancing often is an attenuation, where the shaping is often a a additive, right? So think of shaping like adding that 8 to 10K to the hi-hat and the shaker, for instance, right? But it also could be really to add that snap to the snare at 3 to 4K. That's really creating a shape. Most importantly, in macro mixing, when you EQ, it's still okay to solo some things, but always consider why you're doing that, how it would relate to other tracks in your mix. In micro mixing, you don't solo anymore. Everything happens with everything playing, so that you can really go for that separation and find that spot that guitar sounds better and it's not interfering with the vocal, it's not interfering with the strings. And that's really where the separation EQ comes in. Definition is a combination of all three things. We're balancing, we're shaping, we're separating. We're creating definition by separation and balancing. And while we're doing this, we keep in mind the feeling and mood of the song. So let's look at the basic function of our EQ7, which is the EQ that I want you to use unless you have a fab filter or waves, which is only okay to use if you're in my section. If you have to ask your particular instructor what other plugins besides standard Pro Tools plugins you can use. But we're using EQ7 as an example, and we're going to break down a little bit of what all these knobs are again. So frequency is where we pick the frequency of what we will gain or attenuate. And it's the center. It's not really one particular frequency, because the range of how wide we are actually EQing is set by the Q or bandwidth. So I want you to think about that for a second. The Q is very important because it decides of how much around that frequency we're going to pick up. And often what's the case is that the wider you make the Q, the lower your gain will be. The tighter your Q is usually, the higher your gain is, but you have to be careful not to cause something called comb filtering. That means if you're EQing one particular frequency too much or attenuate it too much, it will create phasing within the sound and it becomes very quickly obvious. Keep your EQ in the range of 3 to 4 dB, maybe max out at 6, but not more. Now, what we are using here is called a parametric EQ. And it lets you choose different types of EQs. So there is bell, low and high shelf, and low and high pass. And you can see here the symbol for bell, here the symbol for low high shelf, and here is the symbol for low pass. Now if you look at the images, you can obviously see that a bell, it looks like a bell. A shelf looks like from here on out every frequency is picked, and a high pass and low pass filter eliminates the frequencies under that range completely, but with a curve. Now compare that to a graphic EQ, and it's a completely different ballgame. Each EQ is set to a specific frequency, and the bandwidth is also set. So you can do some real fine-tuning on here, but I have not seen many people use this in mixes. That's why you don't see it standard. This is a great tool for live, but in the studio, I know some people use it, but it's not a common thing to use a graphic EQ. So let's talk about the actual spectrums, and when we talk about, when you hear me say the low end, the mids, the low mids, the highs, what instruments fall into which range? So obviously our low end, 125 Hz and below, is our sub kick and bass. But it's important to know that the kick is not only in the low end. It actually needs a lot of high mids and often has what I call tubbiness in the low mids. So the kick can be there and the bass should be there. Yes, do we want the bass to be round? Absolutely, and roundness usually comes from 125 and below. But on the other hand, if we have a sub and a very fat kick, maybe the bass needs to live more in the mids. And that's really where the tone is, right? So be careful with that relationship between sub, kick, and bass in the 80 to 500 hertz range, and make sure that you create a specific nudge for each one of those. One important thing to know about the low mids is that that's where your warmth is, but that's also where your tubbiness is. A tubbiness, simple to explain. Take a bucket and sing into it. You hear a sound that sounds tubby. Now, almost every instrument is in the mid-range. I would exclude the sub from this because the sub really only needs to live under 80 hertz. But there's no instrument that I can think of that has something in the mid-range. And then you get to the high mids. Now remember, vocals have low mids, mid-range, high mids, but they are more present in the high mids. And the cymbals are present here, the guitars, piano, other things. And then we get to the very high end, and that's the sizzle, 8K and above. This is where on the vocal you get that air sound. This is where that beautiful sizzle on the cymbals happens. Dangerous range, but very important range of your frequency spectrum. Now, few tips. Obviously, the kick and the bass are the foundation of your groove and your entire mix. Creating separation in that is really where clarity in your mix comes from. But another thing that's important to say about that is make sure other instruments that like to be in that range also, but are not important in that range, are not interfering with that clarity. If you think of a piano, it can easily go down to 50, 80 hertz, but will it interfere with the bass? So maybe a slight shelf in that area of 1 or 2 dB might clear it up. The difference here is that if you would have a solo piano, you would never take that out. But in the coherence of the entire mix and not listening to it solo, you will see how taking things out in that lower mid range out of other instruments can really clear up how the kick and bass sound. Mids are very important in your mix, but they can also be very covering and make your mix sound like putting a hand over your mouth. So find the right type of instruments to add the mix. That's really the trick. Your vocals sound warmer down there, but if you have too much, you get the low proximity effect and your vocal sounds too bass heavy. But there's a warm pad that can live in that area. Piano. Some of the low mids should be in the guitars, but not too much. Again, it can get heavy very, very quickly. Now, one of my things I do a lot is take 1K out of things, because it's just the typical what a telephone sounds like frequency. Obviously, you can't do it out of everything, because then you get a mix of void of 1 to 2K, which is a high mid-range that is fairly important. But you will see that natural instruments that are tracked with a microphone are usually not as heavy in that 1 to 2K range as sampled instruments are. And that has something to do with sampling. So anything that comes from your sequencer, take a quick look at 1 to 2K range and make sure it's not too heavy. Now the highs are essential for your snare to snap, for your vocals to have a nice presence, and actually, you know, the right amount of 8 to 12K in your vocal can really make your vocal sound closer to the listener. If you do too much of this range, your listener will get very, very tired very quickly. And I'm sure you've experienced that yourself in the past, where if something is really bright, you can only take it for a very short period of time. Now, high-pass filter is a very big thing. And again, getting things out of the way of other things in the track is very important, especially in ranges that we are not sure we can actually hear. I'm sure your speakers don't go down to 20 hertz. And the only instrument that really needs to live in that range is the sub 50 to 20 hertz. Everything else, kick and bass, can live in the 30 to 200 hertz range. Piano vocals, strings, guitars, percussions, whatever you want to call, nothing needs to live under 75 Hertz. So the safest thing for us to do to avoid any covering of sounds in that frequency area is to simply filter it out. So you should, except for kick and bass and sub, have a high pass filter on every track engaged on EQ7 in the 50 to 75 Hertz range. Now this is one of the tricks that I love to do when I'm unsure what that sound needs. Now the more you mix, the more you will be able to jump on a sound immediately and just EQ it without having to sweep. Because the experience in your ear has been trained almost like a musician can identify every note. You can identify frequency ranges. But it takes many, many years to get there. And to really find the frequencies that need to be attenuated or something that really could enhance the sound, there's a simple technique to use. You raise your gain of a frequency up 10 dB. You tighten your bandwidth, your Q, and you sweep through the sound and find something that really sounds even worse now, a lot worse than the other frequencies do. I often like to go for the low mid-range and find that worst tubby spot. Then I take that and I attenuate it by -2 and open my bandwidth up to somewhere between 0.6 and 1. And I see how that sounds by bypassing and re-engaging that EQ. And if it enhances the sound, I've done my job. Then I will repeat that same step, but this time I'm looking for something that really enhances the sound. And, you know, gain it, change your bandwidth, sweep, and at that point you find something that really enhances the sound. Only gain it up 2 dB, open your bandwidth 0.6 to 1 Q, and bypass and engage to see if the change is really working. The more you do this, the faster you will get at it. And at the same time, while you're enhancing this frequency, you have to consider all the other tracks that might be in that range. So when you get to the next sound that's in the same frequency spectrum, remember what you did and don't go to the same frequency. So now that we've discussed EQing, let's talk about compression and what compression does. Now, you know, there are some old school engineers that believe that compression is always a bad thing. And I don't agree. I think the wrong compression is always a bad thing, but proper compression and using it in different ways can be one of the most powerful things in your mix. One of the biggest issues that compression can fix for you, instruments that are too dynamic and you're having a problem bringing them up in your mix. And by adding compression, which is kind of counterintuitive if you think about it, you're actually lowering the sound of the peaks, therefore giving you the ability to turn the sound up overall. Therefore, you are loudening the sound by limiting its dynamic range. Which is kind of the same thing as leveling, because what compression does, if properly set, it will reduce your peaks and you reduce your dynamic range and therefore level out the overall level. One of my favorite usages for a compressor is actually reshaping. The best way to show reshaping is actually a kick or a snare and how drastically you can change the sound. But it can also be a guitar. You know, rock guitar, acoustic guitar, whatever it is. You can really shape the attack of a sound by the correct attack and release time. Now, ducking is a very powerful tool, but has to be used correctly. You know, it can be powerful in a mix where you have a lot of counter melodies going on, especially in EDM music. You can see that sometimes there's a vocal, sometimes there's a synth melody, sometimes there's both. Now this often requires a lot of automation in your levels, but it could be simply fixed by ducking one of the sounds with the other. That means sidechain compressing, for instance, the synth melody by triggering the compressor by the vocal. So every time the vocal sings, the sidechain, so every time the vocal sings, the compressor on the synth melody engages, slowly ducking the sound under the lead, and as soon as the lead vocal stops, the synth melody comes back up. Now, a de-esser is also a compressor, and we like to use a lot of de-essing on vocals that are really, really bright and have a lot of S sounds in them. But please remember that the Pro Tools de-esser itself is extremely harsh and will give people a lisp because it literally takes out the entire S. So be very careful. If you have our de-esser, it's a much better de-esser, but again, remember only to use approved plugins by your instructor. And then last but not least, one of the most powerful tools in compression is a multi-band compressor. We also call these dynamic equalization because we're literally EQing by compressing. We don't cover this in this course because there is no multi-band compressor plugin in your Pro Tools setup, though there is one in Logic. It's a very powerful tool, not just for mastering, but even for reshaping certain areas in a vocal, for instance. So when a singer gets in the higher range and certain frequencies stick out more, your multiband compressor can take care of that particular range and keep your vocals sounding smoother. So let's look at the different settings of a compressor. Number one, we have the threshold. The threshold is the level at which the compressor engages. That means level goes over the threshold, compressor engages. But it not only is an on and off switch, it also is a measurement, because by how much you're exceeding the threshold is the important number to determine how much of that will actually be heard. Ratio is the amount of processing applied, which takes the number of what goes over and calculates how much of that will be heard. And we will go through the mathematics of that in a second. The attack time defines the speed of which the compressor engages, which is one of the most important things and one of the least understood things in compression. I often see a kick with a 5 millisecond attack time, which doesn't even give the kick a chance to develop its attack because you're already killing the attack of the kick. On the other hand, I see a snare with a 30 millisecond attack time, and you have to understand that the snare is already finished by the time 30 milliseconds comes in. So the correct attack time can really reshape the sound, and for shaping, this is one of the most important parameters. The release time defines the speed at which the compressor releases, not after it does not exceed the threshold anymore. So if it's still over the threshold, the release time means nothing. As soon as it goes under the threshold, the release time matters. So let's do a quick calculation here so we understand how this ratio and threshold and all this works in math, so you understand how much compression you're actually getting and how important this ratio can really be. If you have a ratio of 4:1, it means for every 4 dB that exceeds the threshold, only 1 dB will be heard. So it's a 3 dB reduction. But to me, that 3 dB doesn't really matter. To me, the only number that matters is that 1. That tells me that for every 10 dB, right? If I do the math, for every 10 dB over the threshold, I divide that by that 4 of that ratio, and I get a result of 2.5 dB. So at a 4:1 ratio, if I go 10 dB over the threshold, I will only hear 2.5 dB of that 10 dB. Now you know how to do the math. If you take this down 2:1, your 2.5 dB will jump up to 5 dB. So it's a reduction by half. This is a reduction by a quarter. So you can simply take this ratio, switch the numbers around, and take that as your multiplier. So a ratio of 4 to 1 is also a fourth. Multiply whatever exceeds the threshold by a fourth, and you get the same number. Now, a couple of things everyone should consider. Compression should be transparent. Transparent means the audience and the listener should not really be able to hear compression. This doesn't really apply to all genres. Sometimes compression really works. I would say, for instance, in rock, compression can be vital for drums. Overcompression is a tool that's used on vocals in rap and rock. It creates slight distortion, and that distortion can sometimes be desirable. Attack times that are too fast will choke the sound, as I just explained earlier with the attack time on a kick, or the opposite, the attack time on a snare too slow will not engage your compressor at all. Using multiple compressors to achieve the same thing is actually more transparent as trying to do it with one. So let's say you have an incredibly dynamic vocal. Well, first of all, I recommend automate it. It's much better than compressing it. But if you want to take care of some of this dynamic with compression, instead of getting 6 dB compression out of one compressor, try 2 gentle compressors at 3 dB of gain reduction, and you will see it sounds a lot smoother. Before you apply compression, use your ears. Listen, analyze, and then decide what your compressor should do. Should it shape? Should it level? Should it balance? These are really the first 3 thoughts that should go through your mind. Now remember that drums, because of their transient and fast nature, usually need a faster release than, let's say, vocals. One of my favorite things is parallel compression. This is a great tool that we will be discussing later. But parallel compression can give you a lot of compression without it really being too audible. So it's a very, very great tool. And it can really increase the punch and attack of drums and guitars and basses, vocals. I've even used parallel compression on vocals, and it works great. The thing about compression is you have to experiment. There's no one rule, no one preset that works all the time. You should have a starting point from which you then experiment with. And experimenting with compression means go overboard and then back up. So you go way overboard so you can really hear how your sound is reacting to the compression. And then you back your threshold up to get within to the acceptable range. Now drums have a much higher compression acceptable range than, for instance, vocal. I would never compress a vocal more than 3 or 4 dB of whereby a drum, it's okay to go 6 dB. Now drums overall as a group, you have to be very careful because they will sound immediately overcompressed. But individual tracks like snares, kicks, and toms can take a lot of compression. But remember, compression adds 1, distortion, 2, usually makes your sound thinner. I am a big endorser of the bypass button. One of my favorite things, because it always tells me if I actually applied a change. Did I really change something? Or am I making it worse? Or am I making it better? So bypassing, engaging is one of the most important tools you should constantly use. Now some compression, like I said earlier, some limits should tell you, well, compression on vocals here, as an example, gives you some ideas about how much you should use. As you can see here in this example, my attack time is 7.3 milliseconds, which means I'm most likely going for compressing the peaks only. I'm not doing an overall compression. And my release time is 132, so it will stay on. But look at this ratio. At a 2.6 to 1 ratio, I'm literally almost reducing it only half. If it goes 3 dB over the threshold, I will only reduce it by 1.5 dB, which is a lot smoother than doing 6 or 7 dB of gain reduction. And remember, compression is audible, and once it becomes audible, it's not acceptable for certain music genres. Now, I would use a second compressor after this, and my second compressor would have probably a 30 millisecond attack time and a 600-700 millisecond release time with a 2-to-1 ratio, not more than 2 dB of gain reduction. This would be my leveler. This one takes out the peaks. Now, kicks, for instance, you can go a lot harsher. But as you can see here, my attack time is 30 milliseconds. I let the beginning of the kick come through and then compress the end of it, therefore making the kick more snap or pop or have more transient information. Drums can take a lot more compression, and 6 dB of gain reduction is okay. Now, I would be careful going any over than that, but I have seen people go higher, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. Now, remember, a snare, for instance, if you go in and you use your little select tool and measure how long a snare actually is in milliseconds, you will see that within 7 milliseconds, the snare is already gone. And it's only the ring of it. So to compress a snare, you have to kind of know how long the sound actually is. And measuring the actual waveform is a great tool to understand how long the sound is. So snare can take a lot of compression, but I actually prefer parallel compression on snares. Bass. Now, bass can also take a lot of gain reduction, and it often helps with real subby basses, really low-end heavy basses, to compress them a little harder, because compression makes them a little thinner and more mid-heavy, which gives them more tone. Slow attack times with the bass will also make it pop a little more. Whereas bass a lot of times is a lot of sustained notes, but the attack of the bass can really help also drive the song. Now, keyboards is something you have to be very, very careful with compression. Especially, I've learned and experienced that pianos can show the slightest compression immediately and will change sound dramatically. So it's important to use low ratios, slow attacks, slow release times on pianos, and really listen for how much it changes. Now, sometimes you want really heavy compression on a piano, like on an EDM record, and that's a different story. But to keep a natural sound, be careful with keys, overall strings, pads, pianos, electric pianos, Rhodes. These are all sounds that translate that compression directly to the ear. Guitar is the same thing, but remember this: when you have distorted guitar, distortion in itself, because it comes through a tube, is basically a compression. So a lot of times distorted guitars don't need any compression, or maybe just very, very light. But you can shape your guitars with a compressor. Acoustic guitars are very dynamic. And my trick with acoustic guitars is fast attack, fast release. So I'm just taking these very transient peaks out with my first compressor, and my second compressor would be a lot slower with a much lower ratio and only 2 dB of gain reduction to kind of smooth it out. A combination of both of these things will make the guitar level out better in your mix without sounding really compressed. Okay, we did EQing and compression. Now the next thing, imaging, right? Let's understand imaging a little more here. If we look at this image here on the right, where it says narrow sound, you can see that there's a left and a right, and that's the angle of how we hear. And then you see a +5 and a -5, which is actually over our 180 degrees and makes things almost sound too wide. If you look at these two images, if you would download the free stereo tool that you can find at fluxhome.com/product/freewares/stereo tool, you will see that using this tool can be very powerful in identifying how wide your mix is at the end, but also to identify how wide individual sounds are and when things are out of phase. Because if you get over the range of left and right, like you see on the wide sound, you can see that some of this information here is actually exceeding our left and right and would be considered out of phase or over widened. But how you pan really changes how your mix sound. The way we perceive mixes from the EQ range from low to high, from the imaging from left to right, to the depth with reverbs and time-based and levels. Levels also change depth perception. Is that three-dimensional image that how we perceive music. So where you place things are very important. It's also important to point out that things that are, if your entire mix is too far out and too wide, that you lose that center that is so important. All the important, very important instruments like kick, bass, vocals, and snare should always be dead center, because that's where our main focus is as a listener. It also, on the other hand, we also focus on the really wide things. So you can see how the separation between center and wide makes it easier for us to focus on this separately than from this. All the information that's in here in between are a little bit harder to identify for us. How does this translate into a Pro Tools session? Well, if we, for instance, take a stereo track like we see in this very first example here, and we know this is the sequenced guitar, for instance, then our second track here is the nylon guitar 1, our third track is the nylon guitar 2, and then electric guitar 1 and electric guitar 2. So, interesting thing, when you put the stereo tool on the sequenced guitar and you put on the and you look at the graph it playing, it is completely mono. Because even though there is a left and right, the sound itself is only centered. Let's look at these nylon guitar 1, and we can see this was tracked with 2 microphones and it actually contains some stereo information. Our third, which is our also nylon guitar, but it's playing individual notes, it's not panned like the first snare is. So first snare is slightly panned to the right, which you can see creates a stereo image that it gets a little more narrow because this is not as wide, and is slightly pulling to the left. Whereby our nylon guitar 2 at completely wide really shows that there is stereo information. Now look at this. Both of them are pan stereo, but this one is completely mono and this one is stereo. So don't be fooled by tracks having a stereo track. Sometimes stereo tracks are simply tracked incorrectly and you have to check. Now you can take any mono sound and you can see how panning over 45 degrees actually pans at 45 degrees here. Why I'm saying 45? Because remember, left is our end point. Anything over left is actually over panning. Same thing applies to the other guitar that are slightly panned to the right. And I'm starting to fill out the space between left and right. Now if you look at this from an overall mix, for instance, a very narrow mix fills the space, as you can see in this image, but a very wide mix at the end will show in the stereo tool was covering a lot of areas and sometimes even go over the left and right. Great tool to identify how big your mix is.